It's hard for me to stomach. I'm just like, I don't know. It seems like a psyop. You bring in the medium. She doesn't tell you what you want. So one of your own officers who already knows stuff, he's the one who delivers the information that you need to put on record.
She answered the questions that they didn't think she would be able to answer. That's not saying there's not a psyop going, but if there was, it would seem as though it was, well, you'll see. There's more than one agency involved in these things. So if it's an op, it's an interagency op.
So she answers the questions, but then the officer delivers like the actual information.
But remember, she had been the one delivering the apocalyptic messages.
Yeah.
Which fit the pattern of this. It's not like she's the only one doing this. There's dozens and dozens.
The messages that don't come true, that don't play out. That's what I'm saying. It's just like,
see, but the pattern, and I don't even remember if I state this or not, but the pattern that, and Keel makes this really clear in Operation Trojan Horse, is that he experienced this himself. He goes into a long explanation. This is a complete huge tangent, but in the Mothman prophecies, the way that whole deal came about, he started receiving messages. He was contacted, and this thing, whatever it is, intelligence, started predicting things, and they came true. And this was a pattern. Like, okay, at first you're skeptical, and then after a while, they tell you something's going to happen, and it happens. And they tell you something else, and it happens. So finally, they gain your trust, and as soon as you trust them, that's when the deception begins.
Yeah, exactly.
And they started playing games with him. They predicted that something was going to happen while the president. I'm so many names and dates and everything in my head, or I can't remember specifically which one it was, but they predicted that when the president turned on the Christmas tree at the White House, that something was going to happen. So he believed it, and he tuned in because he thought that there was going to be, I don't remember if it was a bombing or something. So he tuned in to television to watch the lighting of the Christmas tree because Keel was all in. He believed it. And then nothing happened. And then he had been shown visions of Christmas gifts floating in the river. Was part of the thing that he was telling him was going to happen when when the president plugged in the Christmas tree. So he assumed there was going to be a bombing or something at the White House.
Yeah.
Comes to find out that at that exact moment is when the bridge collapsed and the cars fell into the river. So what he was actually shown was the collapse of the bridge. So whatever the Mothman was or this thing was playing tricks on him. It was leading him to believe one thing when it was really something else, but there was some truth to it. It was not a complete deception.
Yeah, he was seeing the presence at Point Pleasant.
Right.
Yeah,
so
after the collapse.
Is this thing, whatever this agency is behind it, and when I say agency, it could entirely be a government agency. It's some form of intelligence is playing games with people is what this picture that is being painted.
Agreed. Games are being played.
All right. In the previous episode, the last we heard of the endearing L. Ron Hubbard was him sailing off the coast of Florida with Jack Parsons' savings and Sancha, otherwise known as Side Action Betty. As with nearly everything related to Hubbard, accounts of what happened next are inconsistent. However, the results are undeniable. While still in Florida, Hubbard and Betty were married, which apparently no way inconvenienced by Hubbard's existing marriage to his wife Candy. He would soon attempt to mend fences with the Thelemites by alleging that all of his preceding actions were part of an elaborate undercover FBI investigation of Parsons' satanic cult. In May of 1950 edition of Astounding Science Fiction, Hubbard wrote an article entitled Dianetics, The Evolution of Science. The magazine's editor, John W. Campbell, prefaced the story with a glowing testimonial that praised Dianetics as a truly scientific method of mental therapy. It depicted the human brain as an optimum computing machine in which there are, how do you say that word? Aberrative circuits?
Yeah.
Traumas from the past introduced to it from the outside world. If these circuits could be swept away, the optimum brain could be revealed and the subject would become clear. Within months, Hubbard published a book which was an expanded version of his essay, and it became a national bestseller. Putting what he learned from Thelema to good use, within 2 years, Hubbard had formulated a religion around his book. Dianetics would become the central text of Scientology, which echoed the themes of the book, concerning itself not only with this life, but with past lives spent on other planets. Hubbard's background as a science fiction writer is evident in the underpinnings of his new religion, which centers around Xenu, the ruler of a galactic confederacy of once overpopulated planets. 75 million years ago, Xenu committed mass genocide of his subjects through the use of hydrogen bombs, dispersing their disembodied souls, which were then implanted with false theological data by nefarious agents, which we still carry with us today as we continue to live on his prison planet. Scientology is defined as an applied philosophy dealing with the study of knowledge, which, through the application of its technology, can bring about desirable changes in the conditions of life. It is claimed to be a technology that was discovered, not invented. Hubbard described Scientology as the science of knowing how to know. While Crowley struggled throughout his life to popularize Thelema, even with the aid of the charismatic Parsons, Hubbard succeeded where they could not. The Church of Scientology became hugely successful, aided largely by Hubbard's connections in publishing, the media, and Hollywood. It achieved status as the true embodiment of the mainstream UFO cult. Yep.
It's crazy.
Oh, can't be.
Crazy how all this stuff is connected.
I know.
Oh, no. Look at this name. Srinivasa Ramanajin.
I think I did.
Yeah, I'm trying to read that part. Srinivasa Ramanajin was an Indian mathematician who lived from 1887 to 1920. Although he had almost no formal training in mathematics, he made substantial contributions to mathematical analysis, number theory, infinite series, and continued fractions, including solutions to mathematical problems that were then considered unsolvable. Ramanajin developed his own mathematical research in isolation. According to Hans Eyck, he tried to interest the leading professional mathematicians in his work, but failed for the most part. What he had to show them was too novel and too unfamiliar, and additionally presented in unusual ways, and they could not be bothered. A deeply religious Hindu, Ramanajin credited his substantial mathematical capacities to divinity and said that the mathematical knowledge he displayed was revealed to him by his family goddess, Namagiri Thayar. He looked to her for inspiration in his work, and he said he received visions of scrolls of complex mathematical content unfolding before his eyes. He often said, "An equation for me has no meaning unless it expresses a thought of God." Is this the guy that...
More scrolls.
What?
More scrolls.
Yeah, more
This
scrolls.
is the guy that started the string theory stuff,
String theory
right?
stuff, yeah. That's what it sounds like. Sounds very familiar. If it's not, then there's another Indian.
There's another one, yeah.
Okay, John Nash. John Nash was born in Bluefield in West Virginia in 1928 and was famously the principal character of the movie A Beautiful Mind. While at Princeton, Nash arrived at a revolutionary new theory of rational conflict and cooperation, the Nash Equilibrium, which is considered one of the most influential ideas of the 20th century. By 23 years of age, Nash was already an instructor at MIT. He tackled the idea of embedding a surface, placing it into a space without tearing, creasing, or crossing itself. An embedding which does not distort the surface's intrinsic geometry is isometric. In other words, the surfaces above are isometric embeddings of the plane into three-dimensional space. Nash's proof of the isometric embedding problem came as a complete surprise to much of the mathematical community, and his methods were revolutionary. but he suffered terribly from his psychosis. He was terrified, anxious, preoccupied, and persecuted. However, his delusions were not random and obeyed almost inscrutable rules. He felt that he was simultaneously the epicenter of the universe, yet controlled by a psyche other than his own. He was both an abject petitioner and figure of enormous political or religious, albeit secret, importance. Nash assumed that his delusions and hallucinations were part of his genius. A friend once asked him, "How could you, a mathematician, a man devoted to reason and logical proof, how could you believe that you were being recruited by aliens from outer space to save the world?" And Nash's response was, "Because the ideas I had about supernatural beings came to me in the same way that mathematical ideas did, so I took them seriously."
I don't think this is the same guy.
This is a different person.
Let me also point one other thing out
Nash
that I
is a
did
different
not
person.
Oh, okay.
that I didn't write about, but in all of the statements by the 9, they speak quite a bit about embedding.
Yeah. Okay. In 1967, Nash told a colleague that he had stopped taking his medication, and his colleague was upset at this and asked, "Why? When they were making you well, did you stop taking the drugs?"
Hang on a second. Sorry. The embedding thing. So is this like some kind of mathematical equation for what, like, the idea of like the manifestation of a spiritual being in our universe or something? Like the way you put something into another dimension?
I don't pretend to understand it. It was complex, but from my interpretation of what I read that the 9 were saying, what it struck me that what they were describing was the Mobius strip.
No, I'm talking about Nash.
Right,
His
that's the same
equations
thing.
of showing how you can like embed.
But the embedding is the fold. In effect, it sounded like they're trying to do the same thing. It's folding of space.
Okay.
Without folding it, it says.
Well,
Yeah.
right,
What I'm
making
talking
it
about is like,
continuous.
Yeah, like I see what you're getting at.
yeah,
This is how you embed an object
project
into 3D.
something into a different dimension without
Yeah.
destroying stuff
Right,
or opening
yeah.
a giant portal that just
Yeah.
wipes everything out or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry.
So his colleague asked him why he stopped taking the drugs, and Nash answered, "If I take drugs, I stop hearing the voices." To Nash, taking away his delusions and hallucinations would be taking away his genius, which was his most treasured gift. And I would, I'd agree with that. The genius, the Greeks considered that to be something separate from you, right? Okay, Alexander Grothendieck was born in Berlin, Germany in 1928 and is considered among the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. Grothendieck altered mathematics with a velocity that is hard to articulate. He used commutative algebra to solve complex geometrical problems. He innovated in pure mathematics, but his work has applications in cryptography and coding theory. Using tools from algebraic geometry, category theory, and topology, he created an entirely new paradigm. He taught a course on topological vector spaces, the notes from which were subsequently published by the University of Sao Paulo. But Grothendieck burned many of his papers in 1991, though tens of thousands of unpublished pages remain. For years before his death in 2014, at age 86, he could be seen through a ground floor window, writing long into the night. The pages revealed an obsession with an environmental apocalypse. He was said to rave to locals about God and the devil and renounced all of his mathematical work. French mathematician Michael Demageur, is that how you say that? Do you know?
Nope.
Okay. French. In a tribute published in Notices of the American Mathematical Society stating, Grothendieck always seemed essentially different. He was an alien. This sentiment was echoed by Marvin J. Greenberg, a professor emeritus of mathematics at the University of California at Santa Cruz, who stated, "My first impression on seeing him lecture was that he had been transported from an advanced alien civilization in some distant solar system to visit ours in order to speed up our intellectual evolution." Wow. What? In the years prior and following his retirement, Grothendieck began sending strange letters to former colleagues and friends expressing his spiritual beliefs. For instance, in 1987 and in 1988, he wrote a 300-page manuscript accompanying 500 pages of notes entitled The Key to Dreams or Dialogue with the Good Lord, in which he expressed his conviction that God exists and that he speaks to people through their dreams. A few years later, in 1990, he wrote a letter entitled The Letter of Good News, which he addressed to 250 people, declaring that the Age of Liberation will commence on the Day of Truth, 14th of October, 1996.
Another apocalyptic.
Yeah, guess it didn't happen. Okay, Carrie Mullis was a UC Berkeley Nobel Prize winner who dreamed up a technique to exponentially replicate tiny scraps of DNA. He called it polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. One night in 1985, as Mullis took a stroll on his property in Mendocino County, he encountered a glowing raccoon. "Good evening, doctor," the raccoon said. The next thing Mullis remembered, he was walking along a nearby road in the light of morning, a time gap he attributed to alien abduction. He detailed the encounter in his memoir, Dancing Naked in the Minefield. Wow. I didn't know that one.
PCR?
Yeah, he's the guy that made the PCR test.
Yeah. I thought it was like an acid trip or something.
He supposedly was involved something having to do with LSD too. So who knows? It could have been a trick.
Yeah, I think he also saw like the process on an acid trip or something like that.
Okay, so now we remind listeners that, as discussed in the previous episode, Dr. John Dee was a brilliant mathematician and cartographer responsible for the expression of formulas that are completely unexplainable. From this, one could conclude that the unseen forces involved are mathematically inclined. Or they're constantly tricking us with their mathematical bullshit.
What was the guy's name? The PCR?
Carrie Mullis, I believe it was.
Okay. Watcher was asking.
Yeah, I just
I think he had that up there.
Oh, no, the mathematician. Which one?
They're all mathematicians. Which one?
Yeah, Carrie Mullis.
No,
the PCR
he's talking
guy.
about the one before that.
They're all mathematicians, Watcher. Alexander. Talking about Alexander Grothendieck.
Yes.
All right. Go ahead. Keep going.
Okay. So the ancient Romans did not believe a brilliant individual was a genius. They instead believed that they had a genius. At birth, each person was assigned a genius that served effectively as a guide or guardian angel. The Greeks referred to these same spirits as daemons. Elizabeth Gilbert is the author of the international best-selling book Eat, Pray, Love, and has a TED Talk where she speaks about the creative process. During her presentation, Gilbert very delicately elucidates the phenomenon of the muse and points out the high rate of suicide among highly creative people. Although she does not make the connection, we believe, as previously illustrated, mental disorders are also associated with highly intelligent individuals. Gilbert goes on to describe creative experiences such as that of the renowned poet Ruth Stone, who claims that her poems would sometimes chase her like a thunderous cloud, and she would grab them by the tail and pull them back as she transcribed them, and they would be perfect and complete, but written backward from the last word to the first. Just like the Enochian tablets.
Wow.
As discussed in episode 186, UFOs Part 4, there are also those who seek assistance from their daemon. In addition to the famously example previously cited, such as Socrates, Napoleon, and Jung, we also have contemporary examples such as Dr. Tom Zinser, a clinical psychologist and hypnotherapist in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Dr. Zinser is the author of the book Soul-Centered Healing, a psychologist's extraordinary journey into the realms of subpersonalities, spirits, and past lives, and has enjoyed a 15-year collaboration with a spirit entity named Jared, who consults with him about the problems his patients are facing and suggests specific ways to help them overcome traumas, relieve anxieties, and generally live happier and more fulfilling lives. Doesn't Jared speak to him through an employee?
No, his employee is the one that put him in contact. Actually, his receptionist said she was in contact with Jared.
Yeah.
And Jared wanted to speak with him.
Oh, okay.
Alex Sakaris, Skeptico, has interviewed him, I think, a couple of times.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The December 20 through 27, 1997 issue of the British Medical Journal published a paper by Dr. Oh, man, look at that name. Ikechukwu Obialo Azewanwe of London. That is prefaced by the statement, "A difficult case." It tells the story of a stable and competent housewife with children in her mid-40s, referenced only as AB. In the winter of 1984, AB was home reading a book when suddenly she heard a voice in her head that said, "Please, don't be afraid. I know it must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this is the easiest way I could think of. My friend and I used to work at the Children's Hospital, Great Ormond Street, and we would like to help you." AB was obviously terrified and thought she was hallucinating. To ease her concern, the voice stated, "To help you see that we are sincere, we would like you to check out the following." And the voice then gave her 3 separate pieces of information, which she did not know at the time. Upon subsequent verification, the information conveyed was accurate. However, this did little to calm her fear. In a state of panic, AB went to see her regular doctor, who referred her urgently to Dr. Azuyone. How do I say this name? Azwanye. That's it. Azwanye. After an extensive examination, she was diagnosed with functional hallucinatory psychosis. He offered her general supportive counseling as well as medication. This treatment appeared to work, and soon after, she was able to travel overseas. While on vacation, the voices returned and instructed her to return to England immediately to seek medical treatment. Additionally, the article states she was also having other beliefs of a delusional nature. She returned to see Dr. Ozwanye, but the voices had directed her to a specific address. To reassure her that this was just a hallucination, her husband drove her to the address they provided, and it was the computer tomography department of the London hospital. When they arrived there, the voices told her to go in and ask to have a brain scan for 2 reasons. She had a tumor and her brainstem was inflamed. Not knowing what to do, she again saw Dr. Ozwanye and informed him of what she had been told. In order to convince her that this was simply a symptom of her psychosis, he requested a brain scan from that specific lab. When asked for the grounds for the request, he informed them that he found no physical signs suggestive of an intracranial space-occupying lesion, and that the purpose of the scan was essentially to reassure his patient. This request was declined, and Dr. Azwanye was chastised for suggesting the expensive procedure on such grounds. Man. After negotiation, a scan was performed in April, and the initial findings led to an enhanced secondary scan a month later that revealed a left posterior frontal mass with the appearance of a tumor. The consulting neurosurgeon noted the absence of headache or any other focal neurological effects related to the mass and discussed with AB and her husband the pros and cons of immediate surgery for the removal. They chose to proceed, and the voices agreed with their decision. The surgery was performed, and a 2.5-inch by 1.5-inch tumor was dissected from the surface of her brain. When she regained consciousness after the operation, the voices told her, "We are pleased to have helped you. Goodbye."
Oh my God, that's crazy.
The report states that there were no post-operative complications and no return of the hallucinatory voices or the delusions which she had expressed. So Dr. Azwanye notes, "It is well known that intracranial lesions can be associated with psychiatric symptomology, but this is the first and only instance I have come across in which hallucinatory voices sought to reassure the patient of their genuine interest in her welfare, offered her a specific diagnosis, there were no clinical signs that would have alerted anyone to the tumor, directed her to the type of hospital best equipped to deal with her problem, expressed pleasure that she had at last received the treatment they desired for her, bid her farewell, and thereafter disappeared." AB never saved a baby from a burning building, nor made a world-changing discovery. There was never a satisfactory explanation for why she was the subject of this perceived intervention. But how many of these types of interventions go either unreported or unnoticed? Wow. That's a really cool story.
Cool.
I love stories like that.
All right, break time.
Yeah.
Hijacked. I'm going to demand a free-for-all episode with you two guys just talking about all of this stuff.
Okay.
Because, like, the breaks conversation, they're bringing up all this crap. I don't know who these people are or what are these connections, and they're like, yeah, well, we didn't want to mess up the presentation. I'm just like, dude, man, when this whole thing's over, I demand a show with no planning.
I don't think I could function that way.
Yes, you can. You're going to figure out how it works.
Just come in and sit down and we'll talk about this shit. But yeah, one of the things I brought
computers.
up, and I'll just mention it real quick. We don't have to go into it in depth, but I would recommend that people look into the work of Chris Knowles. He's been on Where Did the Road Go? He's talked with Sakaris on Skeptico. I think he's been on Grimerica, but yeah, you can look him up. He's got a blog, Secret Sun, and he basically studies and is constantly pointing out the occult symbolism that are rampant throughout just modern stuff, like large ceremonies. He's always looking at the Olympics or looking at the Super Bowl halftime show, and he's just like, look at all this. Notice that they're doing these rituals in plain sight in front of millions of people on purpose.
That's the documentary that I mentioned earlier that I said if you watch the Crowley one and then you watch this, that they flow seamlessly together.
Yeah.
It's called Out of Shadows. And it's talking about the occult symbolism that's in all of Hollywood.
Yeah. And Knowles specifically has pointed out before all of the occult symbolism and involved in the space in going to space, like that they're just the launches are on occult specific days, ritual days, and he's like, yes, obviously there are launch windows to achieve specific goals when you're launching into space, but there are windows that don't have to be on a day that's also an occult like ritual day. They always pick those, though.
Does SpaceX and these other guys
that's a good question.
Blue Origin and all that, are they doing this
I'm
too?
sure they probably are. I don't know, but NASA, he's like the whole moon thing. You can see all the occult symbolism in it, and clearly we've pointed out the names of the gods of the programs.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I always thought that was just, a throwback to, because they were talking about these gods flying around in space and stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
These guys knew. These guys were all interested in the ancient
pop culture. You look, Lady Gaga, you look at what's her, Billie Eilish. Boy, I'm not my type of music, but
it's all right.
They use a lot of that symbolism. One eye, covering one eye, and their music videos. There's a lot of Egyptian themed, symbology or symbolism, should I say?
All right, let's dive back into this.
I demand it.
Kyle demands a
free for all episode.
Free for all, unscripted conversational.
Well, it's
episode.
not scripted, but I mean. Off the cuff, no prep, no show prep.
Okay,
I'm a professional, guys. Trust me.
In light of all these alleged communications with unseen forces, who or what might we be dealing with? Ghostly voices from beyond the grave, angels, aliens? It turns out there have been studies to ascertain an answer. In 1972, Dr. George Owen, a university lecturer, geneticist, mathematician, and member of the Toronto Society for Psychical Research, I know what this is, assembled a test group consisting of Owen's wife, Iris Owen, former chairperson of Mensa in Canada, Margaret Sparrow, industrial designer Andy H., his wife, Lorne, heating engineer Al Peacock, accountant Bernice M., and bookkeeper Dorothy O'Donnell, and sociology student Sidney K. This group was convened for a parapsychological study which would be overseen by psychologist Dr. Joel Witten. The objective of the study would be to attempt contact with an individual named Philip Aylesford. Yes, the Philip experiment. Aylesford's biography read, Aylesford was an aristocratic Englishman living in the middle 1600s at the time of Oliver Cromwell. He had been a supporter of the king and was a Catholic. He was married to a beautiful but cold and frigid wife, Dorothy, the daughter of a neighboring nobleman. One day, when out riding on the boundaries of his estates, Philip came across a gypsy encampment and saw there a beautiful dark-eyed, raven-haired gypsy girl, Margot, and fell instantly in love with her. He brought her back secretly to live in the gatehouse near the stables of Diddington Manor, his family home. For some time, he kept his love nest secret, but eventually Dorothy, realizing he was keeping someone else there, found Margot and accused her of witchcraft and stealing her husband. Philip was too scared of losing his reputation and his possessions to protest at the trial of Margot, and she was convicted of witchcraft and burned at the stake. Philip was subsequently stricken with remorse that he had not tried to defend Margot and used to pace the battlements of Diddington in despair. Finally, one morning, his body was found at the bottom of the battlements, whence he had cast himself in a fit of agony and remorse. In September 1972, the group began their sittings, informal gatherings in which they would discuss Philip and his life and meditate on him. These settings, conducted in a fully lit room, went on for about a year with no results. Some members of the group occasionally claimed they felt a presence in the room, but there was no result they could consider any kind of communication from Philip. The group eventually decided they might have better luck if they attempted to duplicate the atmosphere of a classic spiritualist seance. They dimmed the room's lights, sat around a table, sang songs, and surrounded themselves with pictures of the type of castle they imagined Philip lived in, as well as the objects from that period. And it worked. During one evening seance, the group received its first communication from Philip in the form of a distinct rap on the table. Soon, Philip was answering questions asked by the group, 1 rap for yes, 2 for no. And they knew it was Philip because, well, they asked him. The sessions took off from there, producing a range of phenomena that could not be explained scientifically. Through the table rapping communication, the group was able to learn finer details about Philip's life. He even seemed to express his personality, conveying his likes and dislikes and his strong views on various subjects, made plain by the enthusiasm or hesitancy of his knockings. His spirit was also able to move the table, sliding it from side to side, despite the fact that the floor was covered with thick carpeting. At times, it would even dance on one leg. Philip's psychokinetic powers were amazing and completely unexplained. If the group asked Philip to dim the lights, they would dim instantly. When asked to restore the lights, he would oblige. The table around which the group was sat was almost always the focal point of peculiar phenomena. After feeling a cool breeze blow across the table, they asked Philip if he could cause it to start and stop at will. And he could, and he did. The group noticed that the table itself felt different to the touch whenever Philip was present, having a subtle electric or alive quality. On a few occasions, a fine mist formed over the center of the table, and the group reported that the table would sometimes be so animated that it would rush over to meet latecomers to the session or even trap members in the corners of the room. The climax of the experiment was a seance conducted before a live audience of 50 people. The session was also filmed as part of a television documentary. Fortunately, Philip did not have stage fright and performed above expectations. Besides table rappings, other noises around the room, and making lights blink on and off, the group actually attained a full levitation of the table. It rose only a half-inch above the floor, but this incredible feat was witnessed by the group and the film crew. Unfortunately, the dim lighting prevented the levitation from being captured on the film, but the footage is available on YouTube. However, by far, Philip's most astonishing feat was the fact that he never existed. Philip's entire persona was a complete fabrication, specifically concocted for the purposes of the experiment. Similar studies were later conducted by other groups, allegedly with the same pattern of results. So this begs the question, was Philip a manifestation formed by the collective imagination of the group? Or was the group contacting an entity attempting to deceive them by assuming Philip's identity? The answer to these questions may not only present a solution to the conundrum posited in Brothers of the Serpent, episode 211, Why Are There No Neanderthal Ghosts? But it might also support John Keel's assertion that attempted communications with those beyond the grave may elicit unreliable and undesirable results. The other possibility, well, you said it, manifestation, the idea that it was a tulpa, right? And yeah, we've talked about this before. We've mentioned it briefly, the Philip experiment. They basically just completely make up this guy's story. And then they all start meditating on him and thinking about him or whatever. And eventually they start getting the same kinds of responses you would get at a regular seance trying to call up somebody who was real and died or something. The point of the experiment, in part, being showing that, well, you get something whether the person was real or not. So that doesn't,
Maybe it's the
So you don't know what you're getting.
Right.
It's the ritual involved that might be the...
Yes, yeah.
Whenever this channeling stuff and they're like, oh yeah, we're channeling this person, it's like, you don't know what you're getting.
Yeah.
They rapped once when we asked if that was who it was.
Exactly.
How could they know that?
Okay, Ray Bauche? Bauche? Ray Bauche is an Anglican priest with a master's degree in theology from St. Mark's School of Divinity and a BA from Peru State College, serving in the Celebration Anglican Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was also the founder and former director of the Fortean Research Center and a former Nebraska State Director for MUFON. In 1991, Bauche was contacted at the church by two Christians who claimed to be physicists working in weapons research and development for the Department of Defense and wished to meet with him. He agreed, and the first of two meetings took place at the Cornhusker Hotel in Lincoln on November 25th, 1991, and it lasted approximately 3.5 hours. During the meeting, the individuals presented their identifications from the National Security Agency, Fort Meade, and the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C. Following this initial meeting, Bauche was able to independently verify the credentials of both individuals. During the meeting, the men engaged Bauche in a theological discussion and presented him with many related questions. It was evident that the individuals were facing some form of spiritual turmoil. Eventually, they disclosed their involvement in a project entailing contact with non-human entities for the development of weapons and intelligence technologies. Although these entities presented themselves as extraterrestrial beings, through their research it was concluded that the entities were instead demonic in nature. Research findings showed that regardless of how benevolent any of the dealings they had with these entities seemed, it always ended up being tainted in some way and ultimately turned out negatively, and nothing beneficial ever resulted. The manner in which this information was conveyed left Bauche with the impression that this had been a lengthy involvement. The entities were said to possess extraordinary and lethal mental abilities, and it was the objective of the DoD program to attempt to control and exploit their abilities, in part through the use of rites and occult rituals.
Okay, so if these are demons that are giving people knowledge on how to build weapons, like in your example, like, here, we'll hand you a spear, why don't they just give nuclear weapons all throughout history, right? I mean, why isn't, in other words, if it was aliens, and we're talking aliens in the physical sense of like people with their own politics on other planets and whatever, it makes sense that they wouldn't want to just give us ridiculously high technology all the time, but that they might play around with causing wars and stuff with, utilizing a little bit of the technology that we have at the time.
You can increase your crossbow efficiency.
Yeah,
by
exactly.
doing this. Yeah.
Whereas if it was a demon, they already understand the universe and they know how all this stuff works, so they can just let's just give them stone technology for a while. And
Consider the timeline that I'm presenting.
What?
Consider where we
Well, the modern
started.
timeline, yeah.
Right.
Why not 1,000 years ago?
Okay. For example, in
Like, in other
All
words,
right.
if your objective is to say wipe out people or control people, why
this-
not give some butt flapper, group like all this knowledge so that they can just take over the world, and then things go as you want them to go? It's just kind of weird. It's like it doesn't make sense.
all right.
If there's an
We
opposing
talked-
force.
We talked about at the end of the last one that Parsons eventually lost his security clearances because of his activities.
Yeah.
Who else? Maybe you may or may not know this. What other very famous historical figure lost his security clearances shortly after his discoveries?
I don't know.
Oppenheimer.
That's not
Again.
answering the question, though.
Well,
the question
in other
is
words-
like if these are demonic entities, in other words, they have access because they are not of this like plane of existence. They have access to like in the legends, right? They like Paimon has all this knowledge of the universe and the workings of the universe and all this kind of stuff, and they can dish it out as they see fit. Why would they hold back certain things? Because it doesn't matter to them. It's not why would they be worried about physical abilities of a race of animals on a planet? Whereas an actual alien race would be worried about our abilities to manipulate physics. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't know that. I see where you're going with this, and I totally understand. It's a valid point, but from my perspective, and I think from the framework of this presentation, alien and demon are not mutually exclusive. In other words, we're dealing with an intelligence
That's why
that we may perceive as being demonic. That does not mean it's not extraterrestrial. It may have.
That's why I made the point that,
right.
like, yeah, they're other beings existing in the universe, in this universe. They're physical beings. They have their own politics. They have their own system, and they might be looking at us like we might look at a foreign country that could be a threat. Whereas if this is a demon in the traditional sense, human physical ability or their ability to manipulate physics, why would that become a threat?
It's not a threat to them.
That's what I mean. So why hold back the technology until we're already almost there and then give it to us? That doesn't make any sense.
That's just laziness.
Based on, yeah, we don't know what kind of timeline. Again,
It's too
it would
hard to
seem
teach
as
the
though-
butt flapper all that shit to get a nuclear weapon.
But if we're going okay, we go back to where we started. Go back where this conversation began. What did Enoch say? What did the fallen angels do? What was the first thing the Watchers did? They gave us technology. It gave us forbidden knowledge,
Yeah.
right? And they taught us metallurgy.
But only makeup and smelting and beer.
Well, and apparently alloys and astrology and the technology of rituals. It refers to it as a technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, the technology of rituals and the names of the stars and the meanings of them and how to read the heavens.
Yeah, that's
See,
why it makes it seem more likely that they are physical beings that also exist elsewhere in
They're
our
flesh
universe.
and blood
I
extraterrestrials.
mean, look at the hair, bro.
It's I think it's more complicated. I think again, go back to Enoch. You're saying there's more than one type. They're all. I made this analogy at one time. I was trying. I have a concept in my head. I can't put it in words, and the way I kind of relate it is seeing these different things, and you're trying to say, well, that's an angel, and that's ferry, and that. Imagine a cat inside of a parking structure, and there's cars driving around all of it, and it's trying to avoid getting run over by the cars. Is the cat looking at this and saying, "Oh, there's a Chevrolet and there's a Ford and there's it. It's all the same to it."
Yeah.
But behind the wheel of those cars there's humans back there. It's not even, in other words, the cat never even considered that there's a person operating that thing that it's trying to stay away from.
And it's definitely not considering that it's in a structure designed for these vehicles, and all the people parking the cars are going to the hotel right next door. Like it can't get the big picture is what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah. But still, I think Kyle's question is valid. And even through all of these examples and everything we've read, there's nothing in here that I would say is completely outside the bounds of technology.
No, absolutely
That's what
not.
I'm pointing out is that when I'm looking at it with this frame of mind, it just says aliens, not actual, metaphysical beings from a different,
Go back to the beginning where I gave my analogies, and I spoke of the potential of a civilization advancing technologically to the point
and
of
looking over
transcending physical existence.
I understand. Yes,
It's still technology.
They still. I totally get that, and I'm not arguing with you. I'm arguing with the guy who was saying this was not aliens. This was demonic.
Yeah, that's the physicist.
Wait, there's a lot more. We're just starting this story. There's a lot more to this.
I think it's a good point. That's all I'm saying.
Well made.
And it's going to explain things that we've discussed in previous episodes. That stuff was leading to this. Now you're going to get, you're finally going to get answers to at least something.
But I'll also make the point that if these same extraterrestrial, super advanced, transcended matter species yet still exists in this universe, have been interacting with our species since time immemorial, then these people are right. They are demons because that's what the demons were named after.
You can't get hooked.
Well, yeah, I know.
Forget the label.
That's why I was trying to not use the label say that this is a civilization with politics that lives on a planet somewhere versus an interdimensional being that doesn't care if we can manipulate the physics of this world.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard and it's very hard to get past those labels because it's like you've built these things up in your mind your whole life, and now you're maybe that's not exactly what it is. That's why I say they're more like placeholders. They're not necessarily definitively something. A demon is this. No, it's not quite that simple.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Agreed. Not simple.
It was the opinion of the physicists that psychotronic and remote viewing technologies developed by the DoD in conjunction with or derived from these entities were part of an elaborate deception, and the entities were the causal factor for the phenomena observed. In short, humanity was being deceived into believing that it was receiving visitations from aliens, when in reality, demonic forces were secretly preparing us for Armageddon. And the DoD's overwhelmingly reckless dabbling into the occult to attempt to reach a Faustian pact with these forces was inevitably doomed to fail and only destined to make matters much worse. So we should at this point remind the listeners of the anecdote presented in the previous episode regarding the advice offered to the DoD during World War II by Carl Jung, which was what? You remember?
Remember, Carl Jung suggested when an organization at the Pentagon asked him to give an opinion, he said it would appear that the Nazis have made some type of an accord.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And I suggest you do the same.
Well, yeah.
Coincidentally, the organization or the group that Jung was advising, the acronym they use for their documents is Top Secret Magic.
Oh, magic, of course. Okay. How do you say this guy's name again? I forgot. Boucher?
Yeah, Ray Boucher.
Yeah. Boucher was left with the impression that he was approached due to his unique perspective as a priest and a theologian with an extensive background in the study of UFOs, due to their moral and ethical consternation with being involved in such research. Boucher had a second meeting with the two physicists at the same location on January 24th, 1992, and later shared some of the information regarding the meetings with Linda Moulton Howe in June of 1994, which was later published in her book Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2. In 2006, researcher and author Nick Redfern contacted Boucher to schedule an interview to obtain details about his meeting with the physicists. Following the interview, Redfern decided to trace back the origins of the preposterous claims, which were obviously either the personal beliefs of a couple of religious fanatics or some form of counterintelligence scheme. Redfern was able to deduce a connection to a particular Air Force base in Nebraska, where he called and requested to speak with someone in the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. When asked what the call was regarding, he chose to be honest and told the receptionist that he was writing an article about a couple of government agents who believed that the UFO phenomenon was somehow connected with demons. He was asked a few more questions and promptly brushed off. 3 days later, he received a call back by an elderly woman from the base, and she said, "Mr. Redfern, I understand you want to meet with someone from the Collins elite." He responded that he had no idea what she was talking about. And she said, "The devil, UFOs, the story, the story." With utter surprise, he acknowledged and was told to expect a call from Mr. Duke. 11 days later in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Redfern met face-to-face with 86-year-old Richard Duke, a former agent for the Central Intelligence Agency and a senior member of the Collins elite. It wasn't long into their conversation before Duke explained that by the late 1940s, Jack Parsons' peculiar activities drew the attention of U.S. intelligence agencies, and they learned that there was far more to the story than anyone outside the government could ever have suspected. Their investigation dug much deeper into his dealings with Aleister Crowley and L. Ron Hubbard and their possible role in generating the UFO phenomenon. Duke brought along a dossier on Parsons, which contained many original documents regarding his investigation, as well as those by other agencies. He stated, "We learned this wasn't the first time the FBI had been speaking with Parsons. Major Sam Bruno himself told us they had a meeting with Parsons after the Kenneth Arnold sighting. And there were tales of Parsons being linked into Arnold. As a strange coincidence, it turns out that Parsons met Arnold through his publisher, Ray Palmer, who, as the editor of Amazing Stories, was a friend of science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard." Duke also pointed out another connection. He stated, Air Force also had reports on Parsons knowing Robert Goddard out at Roswell. We all knew something happened at Roswell with the crash in 47 that wasn't a weather balloon. We knew that. Grapevine things, rumors you hear. But there were some of those guys in OSI who said it had to mean something that Jackie Boy was linked with Arnold and with people like Goddard at Roswell. Furthermore, Parsons, who had claimed to have a UFO sighting himself, publicly proclaimed that UFOs would ultimately, quote, play a part in converting the world to Crowleyanity, unquote, which only heightened the Air Force's concern over Parsons's involvement in the phenomenon. And he went further and stated that in 1948, the OSI planned a meeting with Parsons and asked him if his things with Crowley and Hubbard and trying to bring in equivalent things like Crowley's lamb, there was something he wanted to tell them about what he knew about all this. And according to Duke, when confronted and pressed for answers, a somewhat uncomfortable Parsons conceded that there probably was a connection, that the UFO wave of 1947 probably was linked with his door-opening actions, and that it was not down to chance that he knew Arnold or that he had a tangential link to the town of Roswell. Duke stressed, the Air Force knew they had something with all this, but they weren't really sure what. A small project was established at Wright-Patterson that made subtle and secret appeals to experts within the fields of demonology, ancient religions, and occult practices who could hopefully provide some answers with respect to what it was that Parsons might have set in motion, wittingly or not, and which the military was now struggling to comprehend. God. Duke also noticed that Charles Taze Russell, a prominent early 20th century Christian restorationist minister, had once predicted that the countdown to the end of the world would begin on October 2nd, 1914, and that this date would initiate the surfacing of the Antichrist and the harlot Babylon the Great. John Carter, a biographer of Jack Parsons, noted, It is ironic that John Parsons, who would later attempt to incarnate Babylon and who would also sign an oath stating that he was the Antichrist, was born the very day of Russell's eschatological event. Duke indicated that directly in the wake of the Washington, D.C. UFO incursions, shortly after Parsons' death in 1952, members of the Collins elite met with Air Force officials at the Pentagon to discuss funding for their project, which was to be funneled through the CIA's Directorate of Plans. Concerning this, he stated, and this is exactly why it was kept all so secret in the beginning. Everyone, particularly the Pentagon boys, knew the hammer was going to come down on all this if Congress found out good U.S. dollars were being used to pay for a study of demonology and flying saucers. Maybe a little more mundane than you might want to hear. But that really was the primary reason for the secrecy with us. Not a big conspiracy about what we were doing, but a lot of anger and probably a hell of a lot of ridicule that would come tumbling out if anyone else found out. But there were other connections that were also concerning. For example, self-proclaimed contactee George Adamski wrote his book Flying Saucers Have Landed with an Irish aristocrat named Desmond Leslie, who was known to have personal connections to Aleister Crowley and a long and rich history with the occult. George Hunt Williamson became fascinated by the occult as a teenager and ultimately became a leading figure in the contactee movement. Williamson's reported channeling extraterrestrials, and researcher Sean Devney stated, when Williamson started to channel, it was something truly inexplicable. He would begin speaking in several different voices, one right after the other. In 1954, Williamson published the book The Saucers Speak, which focused on his well-publicized attempts to contact extraterrestrials via shortwave radio and Ouija boards. Richard Duke stated that from late 1952 to the middle of 1953, there were a couple of members of the Collins elite who still believed that the contactee phenomenon involved literal extraterrestrials. But as investigations continued and as more data came to the fore, the group reached a consensus that the entities were highly deceptive and were telling the contactees precisely what they wanted to hear, namely that they were extraterrestrial and they were benevolent. There we go. And they're friendly space brothers. Another example was that of Francis Swan, who we discussed earlier. That's someone who was communicating with extraterrestrials through automatic writing, lived next door to Admiral Herbert Knowles, there's Knowles, a director of NICAP, was interpreted as evidence that demonic forces were attempting to influence a significant player in NICAP to deceive them into fully endorsing the extraterrestrial hypothesis to explain the UFOs. Furthermore, 3 of the 7 CIA officers in attendance when AFA spoke through Commander Larson were members of the Collins elite, and they were very concerned by the fact that some intelligence officials were being seduced into entering altered states to contact what might just as well have been demons as extraterrestrials.
Nope. One and the same.
The allegations that Crowley and Parsons, as well as many contactees such as Adamski, Van Tassel, Williamson, and Swan, were communicating with entities via occult rituals, Ouija boards, and automatic writing was enough to convince the few remaining members of the Collins elite that the contact with was with demonic rather than extraterrestrial forces. So let us remind regular listeners of the podcast that Bruce Fenton, author of Exogenesis, Hybrid Humans, who was a guest on Brothers of the Serpent episode 155, had no knowledge or interest in aliens or UFOs until he started receiving information on the subject via automatic writing. As if all this was not bizarre enough, and if there is any doubt about Richard Duke's allegations, in 1969, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, former head of the CIA's MK Ultra program, now working under Alan Dulles, who was in a relationship with Mary Bancroft of Puharek's Round Table Foundation, received funding for a new project, which became known as MK Often. Author Gordon Thomas wrote in his book Secrets and Lies, A History of CIA Mind Control and Germ Warfare. Operation Often was intended to explore the world of black magic and the supernatural. It is reported that the program recruited fortune tellers, palm readers, clairvoyants, astrologists, mediums, psychics, specialists in demonology, and other occult practitioners to attempt to harness demonic powers as tools of espionage. In the book, see, this is another